Something enormous is unfolding right now across the Pacific, and most Americans have absolutely no idea it's happening. The country that fought 2 world wars to position itself as the undisputed guardian of this region, that built naval bases across thousands of miles of ocean, that spent decades telling the world it was the irreplaceable Pacific power, that country is quietly being shown the door, not by force, not by war, but by something far more telling, by choice. The nations of the Pacific, island by island, treaty by treaty, are stepping back from Washington. And Australia, America's most loyal Southern Hemisphere ally, the country that has stood shoulder to shoulder with the United States in every major conflict since World War II, is now charting a different course. Not loudly, not with fanfare, but steadily, deliberately, and with a kind of strategic clarity that should make every thinking American stop and ask, what exactly did we do to get here? Because this shift didn't happen in a vacuum. It didn't come out of nowhere. It is the direct, measurable consequence of decisions made in Washington. Decisions that the architects of American power are now calling one of the greatest strategic miscalculations of the modern era. Let's think about this carefully, because this is exactly the kind of story that gets buried under the noise of daily politics while the real tectonic shifts happen beneath the surface. And that's precisely where the most important changes in the global order always begin, underground, invisible, until one day the ground simply moves and everybody pretends they didn't see it coming. When Trump returned to office in January 2025, his administration announced the effective dismantling of USAID, the United States Agency for International Development, the world's largest aid organization, which had an annual budget of nearly $40 billion, with roughly $3.4 billion of that dedicated to the Pacific Islands region alone. Think about what that means in practical human terms for a moment. Medical programs fighting HIV, infrastructure support tied directly to climate survival, government training, economic development, all of it suspended, cancelled, gone. And the leaders of these Pacific Island nations, small countries that had built their development models around American partnership, expressed immediate and deep concern. Disappointment was particularly significant in Fiji and Samoa, where HIV and dengue fever infections were rapidly rising at precisely the moment America walked away. Now, I want you to understand something that most of the media commentary completely misses when it covers this story. This wasn't just about aid money. This was about a signal that reverberated across every foreign ministry, every prime minister's office, every strategic planning department from Canberra to Suva to Port Moresby. The signal said, America is not a reliable partner, and once that signal goes out, you cannot unsend it. You can write all the diplomatic cables you want, send all the deputy secretaries of state on goodwill tours you can organize, but the credibility damage from that kind of abrupt withdrawal takes years, sometimes decades, to repair. And right now, there is no indication that Washington even understands the magnitude of what it has done. The tariff announcements in April 2025 compounded the damage significantly. A flat 10% tariff was imposed on all U.S. imports, with additional tariffs hitting Fiji at 32%, Nauru at 30%, and Vanuatu at 22%. Fiji water, which accounts for 66% of Fiji's exports, and tuna, accounting for 14%, were directly impacted. So let's be clear about the sequence here. First, America dismantles the aid programs that these nations depended on. Then America hits them with tariffs that punish their exports. Then American officials go on tours of the region and ask for loyalty and strategic partnership. You can understand why Pacific leaders looked at that sequence of events and decided they needed to start making other arrangements. A senior analyst at the United States Studies Center put it plainly: the United States is no longer the leader of the free world because the free world is no longer following America. The democracies with which the US has been allied since the end of the Second World War are no longer acting in concert with Washington, but in reaction to what the Trump administration is doing across the global landscape. That is an extraordinary statement coming from an institution whose entire purpose is to analyze and strengthen the American alliance with Australia. When your own advocates start talking like that, you know the situation is serious. And then there is Australia itself, because Australia's story in all of this is particularly fascinating, and it tells you something profound about how the global order is actually being restructured right now. The 2025 Lowy Institute poll found a 20-point drop in Australian public trust in the United States to act responsibly in the world since 2024, reaching a historical low in the poll's 2-decade history, with only 36% of Australians expressing significant trust in the United States, 20 points in 1 year. That is not a trend. That is a collapse. That is the kind of number that forces governments to rethink fundamental strategic assumptions, because governments ultimately answer to their populations, and no Australian Prime Minister can indefinitely maintain an alliance posture that the Australian public has lost faith in. Australian Foreign Minister Penny Wong articulated a new foreign policy framework built around what she called the 4 Rs: region, relationships, rules, and resilience, emphasizing the US alliance as embedded within a broader web of relationships rather than standing alone. Now, to the casual observer, that might sound like diplomatic boilerplate, but read it carefully and you will understand that it represents a fundamental reorientation. For 80 years, Australian foreign policy operated on a simple principle: look to America first. The entire defense posture, the intelligence architecture, the diplomatic positioning, all of it was organized around the American anchor. What Wong is describing is something different. She is describing a world in which the American anchor is still in place, but Australia is now actively building other anchors too. That is not the foreign policy of a loyal dependent. That is the foreign policy of a country hedging its bets. And Australia is one of the most sophisticated diplomatic operators in the world. When Canberra starts hedging, the rest of the region takes note. Australia has ramped up diplomatic effort and significantly increased financial assistance to the Pacific over the past 3 years through what Canberra describes as a listening diplomacy. And the results have been striking. According to the Lowy Institute's 2025 poll, 39% of Australians now see Australia as the most influential power in the Pacific Islands, up from 31% the year before, overtaking China, which holds steady at 34%. Australia has stepped into the lane that America vacated, and it has done so not with warships and ultimatums, but with aid, diplomacy, and climate commitments, exactly the things that Pacific nations actually asked for. The contrast with Washington's approach could not be more stark. One of the most significant recent developments was the Papua New Guinea-Australia Mutual Defence Treaty, signed in October 2025, which will be ratified by the Papua New Guinea Parliament in 2026. Australia also advanced bilateral security agreements with Tuvalu, Nauru, and other Pacific nations, covering capacity building, disaster preparedness, environmental security, and respect for sovereignty. These are not minor diplomatic footnotes. Papua New Guinea is a country of nearly 10 million people, sitting at the strategic gateway to the Pacific. A mutual defense treaty between Canberra and Port Moresby reshapes the entire security architecture of the region. And it happened while Washington was reviewing AUKUS and imposing tariffs and dismantling aid programs. Meanwhile, the United States has flagged it will withdraw from the Pacific Regional Environment Agency, the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environment Program, the World Health Organization, and the Paris Agreement, moves that, as analysts note, ironically opened the door wider for America's regional rival China. And here is the thing about China in this story that deserves careful analysis because it is more complicated than the standard narrative suggests. When USAID was dismantled and the panic set in, many assumed China would rush to fill every gap. But in practice, once you exclude the Compact of Free Association States, which are tied to US military access and managed separately, the United States actually ranked only 9th among aid donors to the Pacific, contributing a modest 1.4% of total assistance. Australia, by comparison, contributes roughly $1.5 billion annually to the region. So the financial vacuum was never quite as dramatic as the headlines suggested, but the symbolic vacuum, the narrative vacuum, that is a different matter entirely. In May 2025, China hosted the China-Pacific Island countries' foreign ministers meeting in Xiamen, Fujian province, bringing together senior officials from 11 Pacific Island countries and announced 100 climate change projects to be implemented over the next 3 years, 100 climate projects, announced at a summit where 11 Pacific foreign ministers sat in the same room with Beijing. Meanwhile, Washington was busy reviewing whether AUKUS, its flagship Indo-Pacific initiative, was financially favorable enough to American interests. You begin to see how the optics of this play out for the countries actually living in the Pacific, countries whose coastlines are literally disappearing under rising seas, countries for whom climate change is not a political debate but an existential emergency. With roughly 83% of USAID programs officially cut, the announcement signals the end of 7 decades of US global leadership on development. Analysis shows the aid cuts will restore China as the world's largest bilateral development partner, with the United States ceding larger partner status to China in more than 40 countries. 40 countries. Let that number sit with you for a moment. in one administrative decision, the United States handed Beijing a geopolitical dividend that China's strategists could not have manufactured in 20 years of patient maneuvering. It was a gift, an unforced error of staggering proportions. The most recent U.S. national security strategy, released in November 2025, makes clear that the White House's top priority is maintaining American dominance of the Western Hemisphere, and spends relatively little time discussing the strategic importance of the Indo-Pacific. China does not appear in the document until the 19th page of a 29-page strategy. Think about what that tells you. After 15 years of bipartisan consensus that Asia and the Pacific were the central theater of American strategic interest, after the Obama pivot, after the Trump first-term pressure campaign, after Biden's AUKUS announcement, the current administration buries China on page 19 of its national security document, and they wonder why allies are recalibrating. The events of 2025 broke the world order that had prevailed throughout this century. The United States abandoned any pretense of upholding rules-based trade. Its long-standing refusal to allow the filling of vacancies on the WTO's appellate body left dispute settlement inoperative, with more than 50 members relying on alternative arbitration arrangements as a substitute. The rules-based international order, that phrase that American diplomats repeated for decades like a sacred incantation, is now largely administered by the countries America is supposed to be leading, while Washington pursues a transactional bilateralism that treats even longtime allies as potential adversaries in a zero-sum game. Pacific Island nations have grown tired of being pawns in US-China competition. In the most aid-dependent region in the world, international assistance has become a source of frustration as much as benefit, due to its use as an instrument of great power rivalry. These nations are now insisting that development and security partnerships respect sovereignty and align with the region's own priorities. And this is the part of the story that I think is most important for Americans to understand, because it speaks to something deeper than geopolitics. It speaks to a moral shift in how the world relates to power. The Pacific nations are not simply switching sides from one great power to another. They are asserting that they will not be used as chess pieces. They will not accept aid that comes with strings attached to someone else's strategic competition. They are demanding to be treated as sovereign actors with their own priorities, their own dignity, their own right to determine their future. That is a moral claim. And when Washington responds to moral claims with tariffs and aid cuts, it doesn't just lose the argument, it loses something far harder to recover: the credibility that gives great power its actual power. One analyst described the current American position in the Asia-Pacific using Hemingway's description of how bankruptcy happens in The Sun Also Rises: two ways, gradually, then suddenly. The network of alliances and security ties isn't about to unravel overnight, but the idea of an American Asia-Pacific is already dead. It just keeps moving, zombie-like, sustained by bureaucratic inertia and the absence of alternatives to the US security umbrella. That is one of the most precise descriptions of imperial decline I have encountered in recent analysis, because that is exactly what the gradual then sudden pattern looks like from the inside. You maintain the forms while the substance drains away, the bases stay, the treaties remain on paper, the military exercises continue, but the trust is gone, the moral authority is gone, and without those, the whole architecture is just an expensive monument to a past that no longer exists. Analysts at the RAND Corporation suggest that Australia is now best understood as a cusp state, a nation that exists delicately on the border of established regions, positioned to leverage its geographic and strategic location without full alignment with either the United States or China. That is an extraordinary thing to say about a country that has been America's most steadfast partner in the Indo-Pacific for 80 years. The fact that serious strategic analysts are now discussing Australia's future in terms of flexible hedging between great powers rather than unconditional alliance with Washington tells you everything you need to know about how the ground has shifted. Australia's Foreign Minister Penny Wong and the Albanese leadership have been pursuing what analysts describe as a tightrope diplomacy, seeking to maintain strategic alignment with Washington on defense while protecting economic interdependencies with Beijing in a complex environment where Canberra can no longer confidently rely on the Trump administration. A tightrope, that is the image, that is the diplomatic posture of a country that used to stand on solid ground. And the reason the ground became a tightrope is not something that happened in Beijing or Canberra. It happened in Washington. It happened in the decisions that were made, one by one, to cut aid, impose tariffs, dismantle institutions, and withdraw from the cooperative frameworks that held the Pacific together. In 2026, Pacific nations are entering the year with a more assertive posture, pushing ahead on climate justice and self-determination, insisting that development and security partnerships respect sovereignty and align with regional priorities. The mood, as Palau's president captured it, is clear. Partnerships will be welcome, but on Pacific terms. The door is open, but on their conditions, not Washington's. The door is open. That is worth holding on to, because in the midst of all this analysis, it is easy to lose sight of the fact that this is not a permanently closed chapter. The United States still has the ability to re-engage, to rebuild credibility, to demonstrate through sustained action rather than words that it takes its Pacific commitments seriously, but the window for doing that without significant cost is narrowing. Every month that passes with the current posture in place is another month of ground ceded, another month of narratives hardened, another month of alternative partnerships consolidated. The real question, the one that American policymakers seem unwilling to confront directly, is whether the current administration understands the difference between short-term transactional gains and long-term structural power. You can save money by cutting aid programs. You can look tough by imposing tariffs. You can renegotiate the terms of AUKUS to extract more financial concessions. All of that produces short-term wins that make for good domestic political messaging. But the cost of each of those moves is paid in the currency of credibility. And credibility, once spent, is extraordinarily expensive to rebuild. The nations of the Pacific are not naive. They have been watching great powers come and go for generations. They know the difference between a partner and a patron. And when a patron starts behaving like a shakedown artist, they start looking for partners elsewhere. That is exactly what we are watching happen. Not a dramatic rupture, not a crisis moment. Something slower and more durable. A quiet, steady, irreversible drift toward a world organized around different centers of gravity than the one America built and led for 80 years.